Welcome everyone. It's Darlene McLennan here. I'm the manager of the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training, ADCET. And on behalf of ADCET and NCVR, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar. It is wonderful to have Dr. Annie Venville and Professor Ali Vossi present to us on supporting tertiary students with disability, exploring the use of individualised and institutionalised level approaches in practice. This has proved to be a very popular topic, with over 300 people registering to attend this webinar. Now, before we begin, I just want to go through a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being live captioned by Bradley Reporting and will be recorded. The recording will be placed on ADCET after the recording has been captioned. This may take up to a week. Unfortunately, the GoToWebinar platform is not as accessible as we would desire for screen reader users. If you are a screen reader user, and if you have any questions or comments, you're able to email jane.hawkswood@utas.edu.au. So that's JANE.Hawkswood, which is HAWKSWOOD@utas.edu.au. All participants have been muted. This is to ensure as little background noise is received during the webinar. The presentation will run for around 50 minutes, and we will have a few minutes for questions at the end. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to enter your questions in the question pod, or if you're a screen reader user, send your questions to Jane. I will choose a few at the end of the presentation to ask the presenters. With so many registered for this webinar, we won't have a chance to answer all your questions, but Annie and Ali have kindly offered to answer the questions offline, and these will be posted as a Q&A on ADCET in the coming weeks. We will also include the questions that have come through on the registration form. Also, if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please email jane.hawkswood@utas.edu.au. Okay, now I will throw it over to Ali and Annie, and I think Annie's going to start us off first, and we hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Darlene, and thank you to all of you who have given up your time to talk with or listen with Ali and I today. This is an important area of work, and as you all know, we work and you work in an area of increasing complexity. We are struggling with a reduction in resources, and that's, you know, at the same time there's increased participation in our educational environments by students with more complex learning needs. I'm telling you nothing new when I'm telling you that there is a greater need for us to adopt and use evidence-based practice. So simply put, what we need to be able to do is demonstrate why we do what we do and how we know what we do works. Next screen. So when we think about the current approaches to supporting tertiary students or post-secondary students with learning, mental illness or chronic health conditions or disability, we all know that access to support services is reliant on self-disclosure. Now, what this means is that some students will elect not to disclose, and therefore they will not have access to some of the supports and opportunities for adjustment that they would had they elected to disclose. Students also tell us and you tell us too, I might add, in our research, that there is a lack of clarity around what to do with students, what to do for students, who has responsibility for negotiating, implementing reasonable adjustments, and also students tell us that despite the best efforts of universities and training providers and individual staff to promote the support services available, students still tell us they don't know who to go to, when to go to, and how do they know what will work. Which leads us then to asking that question, which is what actually works. So I'm now going to talk to you about two pieces of research that we've undertaken. I'm going to talk with you about the one piece that we named Unfinished Business, and then Ellie will talk to you in more detail about the institutionalised and individual level supports. Next screen. So the Unfinished Business study, it had its focus on students with mental illness only. The Supporting Students in Tertiary Settings study, looking at the individual and institution-wide supports, was a much broader student cohort. So hopefully we're going to have something that will be of interest to most people in the room with us. Next screen. The Unfinished Business study was designed to improve understanding of the factors influencing successful course completion for vocational education and training students with a mental illness. Now, you know, like we could say, of course this matters, but why did you do this? The key reason we did this is that students who had disclosed a mental illness to their training provider had the lowest course completion rate of any other student group, and that's allowing for every other disability group. And we thought, what's going on here? Because as we all know, disclosure is the kind of the key to support often and to reasonable adjustment, and yet here we are finding that students who did disclose had the lowest rate of course completion. So we ran a case study over a 12-month period, and again funded fully by the NCVR, for which we're intensely grateful. And we ran this over 4 research sites. So we had a private vet provider in an inner city location, and we had 3 public vet providers across different locations, so remote, regional and outer metropolitan. 20 students with a mental illness joined the study, and 20 teaching and specialist disability staff were our participants. Next slide. Just briefly to just capture the findings here in terms of the factors for course success. Again, these are things that I'm sure you won't argue with me about, and students and staff all agreed on this. They all agreed that students should be reliable. They should be able to manage themselves and to take responsibility for their educational experience. Students thought that every bit as much as the staff thought that. They all agreed that students should be in the right course, that they should have clear goals, that they should have external supports, access to study support, and that they should attend regularly, and that they should submit their work on time and receive timely feedback from teaching staff. Where they disagreed was on the place of disclosure. And this is important for us again, because as you all know, unless people declare a condition, it largely excludes them from services, a range of services. Next slide. So when we think about why students, or what are the different understandings of disclosure, and this was key to it. Students thought differently than did staff. Next slide. Students are continually engaging in what they describe as a cost-benefit analysis. They are continually weighing up the benefits against the costs of disclosing. And in this case, it was disclosing a mental illness, but this is just as relevant for students who have conditions that are largely invisible or hidden. So we can think about conditions like traumatic brain injury, chronic fatigue, so other things that are not necessarily visible. And generally, the cost of disclosing had to be less than the cost of not disclosing in order for people to do so. So a good question for you to ask me here, and I'll ask it for myself, is why then did students disclose? 3 key reasons. One was desperation, and it was really a desperation to fail not yet again, so that outweighed the perceived costs. And when we're talking about costs, it was often stigma that people were most fearful about. Some students spoke about an obligation to disclose. They described terrific, supportive, generous staff that somehow they then thought they needed to give them something to justify staff's what students described as kindness. My guess is that many of the staff just saw that they were doing their job and were in fact just being educators, but students perceived an obligation to give some information. And then a very small minority of students made the decision to disclose as an act of advocacy for self and others. And I need to underscore that that really was the minority. Next slide. I think that it's really important for us to remember in the vet sector, and increasingly in the higher education sector, where we have more and more casualised staff, it is more common for students to be taught by someone with whom they may end up getting a job, or someone with whom they may be on an interview panel. So what students tell us that they're particularly aware of is the need to present the best self. You know, that notion of putting our best foot forward. And I'd just like to read a quote to you from one of the student participants in this study that I think captures so eloquently that notion of putting forward the best self. And so this is from a student, a participant that I've named Elaine, and Elaine was about a 32-year-old international student. And he said to us, he said, well, if I talk openly with my teachers about depression or anything like that, because they're in the industry, I just fear that, that one day if they're to interview me for a job or take part in a project, they'll think, oh, Elaine, that's the guy who was depressed. He didn't cope with his previous job, so he quit. I just fear that kind of information, might escape. I know that this depression I'm going through is just a phase and not something that's going to last forever, so I just want to keep it to myself. I just don't want to be perceived as depressed. As a depressed person, a sad person. So what Elaine speaks to very clearly there is the fear of losing control of information. And as one other student said to me, once I disclose this information about myself, it's no longer mine to control. I then have to trust that other people will deal with it in a respectful manner. And you know, as certainly many students' experience would suggest, that that is not always the case. Next slide. So and again, just thinking about disclosure, because it is so central to gaining support, we do need to pay particular attention to staff perspectives of disclosure. For the staff in this study, and certainly in my experience in both the vet sector and the higher education sector, most staff think that student disclosure is in fact the right thing to do because it's a means of opening the way for access to support services. None of us would argue with that at face value. However, there's a really interesting kind of incidental finding out of this study. I asked each and every one of the staff participants that, you know, who were advocating student disclosure, that if they had a mental illness, would they disclose that? And to a person, they said no. They were unwilling, they said, to risk the social stigma potentially created by disclosure of mental illness. And each and every one of them had a story of a staff member who had disclosed and who the organisation had not treated, in their eyes, well. So it's just an interesting thing for us to think about when we're asking students to disclose, when staff won't trust the organisation that they work for with that information. So I think that's just worth keeping in the back of our minds. So just as I wrap this up, it's really important to locate student and staff values and beliefs about disclosure within its context. And the context here is vet, and it's just as relevant to higher education. Organisations are mandated by the Disability Discrimination Act to provide reasonable adjustments. The pathway to reasonable adjustments is disclosure. We know that at the point of enrolment, students are provided the opportunity to disclose a disability or health condition, and this is sometimes tricky ground for students. It is often not clear, students tell us, what happens to that information once they disclose. There is generally a belief students hold that if they disclose, that services will follow disclosure. You know, and I know, that does not just happen. In most of our services, the responsibility for help seeking lies firmly with the student. Now, I'm not arguing with that. I am just suggesting that that's not always clear to students. So what this study did was prompt Ellie and I and our other colleagues to think about what are the adjustments that are happening in our institutions, in our educational institutions, what are and also that what are the adjustments that are dependent on disclosure that are being offered in our institutions, and then what are the other types of supports, and so these system level supports that are not dependent upon disclosure and that may in fact make a difference to a student's educational trajectory. So with that, I would like to hand you over to Ellie, who will take you through this next study. Next slide.
Thank you, Annie, and hello everybody. I'm Ellie Fossey and I will be talking you through the next part of the presentation. So following on from what Annie has been saying, this is a study I'm talking about in which we have looked more intentionally at the issue of the provision of supports to students. And in particular, we were interested in three things. First of all, what are the range of supports that are being offered to students who experience disability or a health condition? And how are those supports implemented? And then thirdly, how useful are those supports in relation to students' learning? So this is a qualitative study. It was guided by a reference group of expertise from within the vet sector and the university sector, a mix of teaching staff, student support staff and disability service staff. So we designed this project together, and our main focus was qualitative interviewing, and we chose to interview students, disability support staff and course leaders in order to understand these issues of the range of supports, how supports are implemented and the usefulness of supports for student learning from these three perspectives. Next slide, please. Okay, so you might wonder, why did we choose to look at these three different perspectives all in the one study? So from my point of view, if I looked at the evidence at the time, what we knew, as Annie has been describing, is that there are a number of students who enrol in tertiary education who might either have registered or not for support, and the sector collects some data about how many students with ongoing health conditions and disabilities enrol in the sector, and it collects some information about completion rates, and as Annie indicated, there are higher levels of students not completing from these cohorts. What neither of those pieces of data collection tell us about is what happens in between when a student enrolls and when the student is either successful or not, as the case may be. So the kind of how of the supports for students in their learning is a bit like a mystery black box, if you like. But there are a number of players who each contribute to what goes on in that, what I'm calling a black box, and they include the students themselves, but interconnected with the students are the people who are involved in the teaching, the people who are involved in the disability support. There are probably others that you might name as well, but we chose to focus on those three perspectives with the acknowledgement that they interconnect with each other and each play a role in the provision of supports for this group of students. Next slide. So this slide describes for you what we mean by reasonable adjustments, which are an individualised kind of student learning support for which students who experience disability or a health condition are eligible, provided they register with the tertiary provider's disability service. And the other kinds of supports that we've described as institution level learning supports are the sorts of supports that are available to all students within the particular institution. So those might include the kinds of study skills supports, library supports, information and technology supports that institutions provide. And those are accessible to students without needing to disclose any particular health-related or disability-related issues. In comparison to the reasonable adjustments which are provided to enable students who experience disability or ongoing health conditions with access and the means to participate in educational training on equal footing with other students. So we tried to look at these two kinds of support within this particular study. Next slide, please. So here I'm going to sort of briefly summarize for you our, if you like, the main headlines from our findings, and then I'll talk to you in a little bit more detail about some of these individual findings. Probably the main finding from both the student and the disability support staff and from the course leader perspectives is the process of actually supporting tertiary students with disabilities is complex. So often I think we were told that people assumed that once a student's learning support needs were identified, that this would sort of solve the issue of putting the supports in place. But in fact, what students themselves said and what staff said was that the process of putting those supports in place is not quite as straightforward as merely identifying what's needed and then that sort of fixes the problem. There's actually a set of processes not only around identifying learning support needs but also around negotiating and implementing supports, which are quite complex. And part of why they're complex is because there are multiple people to engage in those processes. So the students, the teachers, the disability support staff, and sometimes for particular sorts of reasonable adjustments there might be other technical staff who need to be involved in creating the necessary adjustments for students. So that's probably the main message, is that the process of implementing support is complex. Secondly, it was quite striking that students themselves described quite a wide range of individualised reasonable adjustments that they were accessing. These reflected very much the diversity of students' own learning needs and also the diversity of the particular learning activities, assessments and learning environments in which students were engaged. So to put that another way, particularly for those of us who are academic staff, it's not always easy to know that students in the different courses or the different units they might be engaged in are actually experiencing quite different kinds of learning activities, assessments, learning environments. And so the adjustments that they sometimes need across those can be quite diverse. The third main finding was that the institution level supports that students were using and finding particularly useful were those around information and communication technologies and also those around inclusive teaching practices. So I'll come back to a little bit more detail about that in a minute. But we concluded from these findings that in fact those learning supports that are, if you like, institution level learning supports available to all students could in fact be more actively used to enhance the learning support for students with disability rather than us relying on the pathway solely of students going through disability support services. And in fact this might be one of the ways in which we, if you like, adjust in organisations to the recognition that not all students choose to disclose the issues that they have for the kinds of range of reasons that Annie was describing. Next slide. Okay, so on this slide I've tried to illustrate for you the 4 processes involved in providing disability support for students that were described in our study. So the 4 boxes refer to the 4 processes. So the first box, finding and accessing a disability service. Students particularly talked about both their choices around when to register and variability in their awareness of both of there being a disability service and the processes by which you might register. So what was apparent particularly from a student perspective is, and perhaps this shouldn't be a surprise to us, is not everybody starts a course with a pre-existing health condition or disability. Sometimes these arise during your course, and so relying on enrolment as the time for us to ask students to register for these kinds of services can't be our only strategy, because it's not necessarily the relevant time to register for every student. In addition, some students really don't know whether they need to register at the beginning of a course or even at the beginning of a semester, and describe what they referred to as, if you like, a wait and see approach. I'll wait and see how I go with the course, or I'll wait and see how I go with the unit, and if I find I need assistance, then I will go to the disability service and ask for that assistance. So there are some issues for us around how we make students aware of the services available to them. So that's the first process. The second step in the provision of disability support is to identify the suitable supports for a particular student when they seek help. And both the disability service staff and the students talked about the importance of collaboration between them in this process. So from both points of view, collaboration was necessary to gather sufficient information about the student's learning needs and about the requirements of the particular course the student was in. And there was recognition that whilst disability staff have a lot of knowledge about the available supports for students, students themselves have a lot of knowledge about their own challenges, but also what they've tried previously and what did or didn't work. And students varied in their view about how much that knowledge of theirs was taken into account in the sort of recommendations that were made for learning supports for them. The third step, having identified whatever supports might be suitable for an individual student, the third step then is to negotiate the implementation of those learning supports. And there were quite varied views amongst the group of people that we interviewed about what the best way to negotiate the implementation of learning supports was. So in some of the people interviewed talked about disability support staff being the people who who negotiated directly with teaching staff on behalf of a student. So that was one way that learning supports could be implemented. Second way, many of the students particularly talked about this. They felt that it was assumed that it was their responsibility to, having got a support plan, that it was their responsibility to go back to the teaching staff and say, this is this is the learning support I need. And then there were a few examples of a more collaborative negotiation where disability support staff and students together met with teaching staff to work out what would be the best way to implement the learning supports that a particular student needed. Overall, whichever of these methods were being used, students expressed varied preferences between those methods, but their overall message was that they wanted a say in which approach was used. So some of the time, students described it as much more stressful for them to do the negotiating, and they wished that the disability support staff would be more actively involved with them. Other times, the students preferred to talk with the teaching staff themselves. And underpinning these preferences often was the nature of the relationships that the students felt they had with both the disability support staff and with the teaching staff. And so when those relationships were better in either or both cases, then the students were more comfortable with the involvement of those particular staff in sorting out how to implement supports for them. Okay, and the fourth process here so if we assume that we've found a service, if I'm a student, I've found the service was the first step. I've collaborated with a disability support staff member to work out a plan. Then that person and I have worked out how to negotiate with the teaching staff to implement those learning supports. So then the fourth piece of it is actually using those learning supports in practice. And here the students talked about learning supports as being particularly useful to enable them to participate in learning more fully, and specifically they describe learning supports as effective when they achieve one of three or four things. First, when they enabled the students to better understand their own learning needs, when they enabled the students to cope better, when they enabled the students to enjoy their learning better, and as you might assume, when students felt that the learning supports enabled them to do their best in their studying. So those are a wider range of benefits, if you like, for learning support than merely about getting good marks or getting through the course, which tended to be the emphasis that disability support staff and course leaders focused on. So there's a bit of variation there in how learning supports are perceived. From a student point of view, the individualised types of support, so the reasonable adjustments, were not always easy to apply in practice. So they had recommendations, there had been some negotiation with their teachers about how to put these adjustments into practice, but the reality for some students was that the reasonable adjustments were actually hard to implement for a range of reasons. Some students identified physical barriers that were not so much at the level of between the teachers and the students and the course, so things like that there wasn't parking in an area that was convenient to the buildings that the students needed to access, could be a physical barrier. There were problems with lifts or other sort of physical facilities that some students relied on, and therefore if those weren't in place or were unreliable in some way, then that created a barrier to students even getting to their classes to then access the adjustments that were put in place for the learning itself. So there was some kind of wider, if you like, barriers sometimes. Some students also found that felt that there were attitudinal barriers to the use of reasonable adjustments in the classroom, and in particular they described sometimes feeling that the mere implementation of an adjustment singled them out in some way, so it made them more noticeable. So an adjustment like having a note taker present or an assistant present to sign for you, sort of for some students, whilst those were valuable supports, on one level they were also things that singled the student out as different from their peers and sometimes limited the interaction between them and their peers. So that what they were suggesting was that there in some ways needed to be more thought given to the rest of the class and how the rest of the class could engage with a student in that situation to be more inclusive. So less of an adjustment focused on the individual student as the problem, if you like, and more an adjustment made to the teaching for all the students in order to be more inclusive. Next slide, please. So what does this tell us about good practice? I mean, this is certainly a relatively small qualitative study about this, as I described it earlier, as the sort of black box of what actually happens in relation to learning support. But I think it gives us some clues to what might be good practice and or best practice in relation to how we offer support to students. Certainly there's a key message that our processes for and decisions about implementation of support and adjustments need to be student focused, but they also need the student to be at the centre of the process. So they need to be student centred, not just focus on the student's needs. And I think that means collaboration is key in the whole process of how supports are selected, how supports are implemented, and in getting feedback about whether and how those supports are working. So that's probably the key message, I think, is to think about how we can be student-centred in the process, not merely in the finding the solutions to students' problems. Next slide. Okay, so on this slide, I'm not going to go through all of these, and probably many of them are familiar to you, but on this slide we have a list of the reasonable adjustments that students described in this particular study, and they range from the flexibility in assessments, meaning extended assessment due dates or choices of assessment format, ranging from, you know, if you've got a presentation that you could perhaps do it orally instead of doing it in written form, that you could submit an assignment electronically instead of in person if the travel or mobility issues are getting in the way, changes to assessment conditions around using computers or recorders rather than handwriting, allowances that probably many of you are familiar with around extended exam times, being located in quiet rooms, allowances to have food or beverages available. Obviously these are reasonable adjustments that suit people with different kinds of learning issues, but they give you a sense of the range. There were some students who had specialist adapted equipment of one sort or another, and there were other students who had, I've called it adaptive equipment, but it's, you know, equipment that is relatively easily available, like having an audio recorder, having an iPhone that you use for your recording. So it's not necessarily specialist, but it's giving you another way to capture information. there were fewer students who were using in-class supports, but of the sort like note takers or participation support in terms of a teaching aid or assistance. But there were a lot of students who talked about the value of having study materials and recordings made readily available online, and this seemed to accommodate quite a number of learning challenges that were both mobility related and mental health related and related to learning disabilities, so that some of these supports have quite broad application. They're not tied to particular disability types. Okay, and then there were a range of other, if you like, academic supports around having materials available in varied formats, printed, online, screen reader accessible, audiobooks, and so on. And for a much smaller number of the students, individual tutoring and study skills development. So as you can see, quite a wide range of supports were being used by the students. And these were all supports that the students had negotiated through disability support services. Next slide. So this slide provides you with some examples of supports that students with disabilities were making use of, that, if you like, were institution level supports. So they were available for any student. And these ones highlight some of the ones that students with disabilities found particularly useful. So certainly flexibility in learning activities and assessment formats was something that many students talked about as being useful. So when there was a choice of either presenting orally or presenting in written form, or when there was a choice between demonstrating something physically or describing how to do it and instructing somebody else. So those kinds of choices were helpful for some students. Other things that students talked about as useful were when there was teaching in class around time management, stress management, coping strategies that would be useful for a particular class. And so they quite liked when those sorts of issues were addressed in the group as a whole. They were helpful to them as students with disability, but they were also helpful to the wider group of students. And certainly the making available of course materials online so that students could go back and revise, could review material before a class, could access them in a more easily because they didn't have to navigate travel and parking and those kinds of things. Certainly that online method of delivering material, not necessarily as the form of teaching, but as the backup to the face-to-face teaching, that was valued by the students. And I've also listed on this slide a number of things that students talked about that were not really institution-level learning supports and not really reasonable adjustments in the sense that they weren't provided but through the disability service, but they were things that students had initiated or discovered for themselves as being helpful to them in managing their learning challenges. So a range of non-specialised equipment around carrying materials, around particularly mobile devices for managing schedules, study skills, recording, watching, listening to lessons. The online world clearly makes it a lot easier for many students with disabilities to access information and resources that assist them with their studies. And some students talked about using time and stress management strategies, including things like reducing their study load or studying part-time for periods of time. So quite a wide range. And I guess what was striking to us in this is that students themselves are quite a good resource for identifying what it is that might help them with their learning support needs. And when I say that students themselves, I mean both the student who experiences a particular challenge, but also their peers who've experienced this before them. So that one of the things that was striking in the interviews was that there wasn't a great deal of institution level support for creating peer groups or fostering peer contact in order for students with disabilities to learn from each other about the kinds of strategies that they find helpful. And so I think that is something that we could do better in tertiary education. My final slide. Okay, so I'm aware that we need a little bit of time for questions, so I'm not going to talk very much about this slide except to say that our conclusion in terms of enhancing the inclusive learning supports for students was that we need to kind of take into account, if you like, three interconnected sets of issues, and on this slide I've drawn them as three interconnected circles. So there's the fact that we have a diverse group of students with a wide range of strengths, abilities, difficulties and lived expertise around being a student. So that's one set of factors. Then I have a circle for thinking about the learning context. So what are the learning tasks or activities, the assessment tasks, the teaching approach and the styles of interaction that are part of the learning context. So that's the second set of factors. And then the third set of factors is more about the institutional structures. So it's what's the campus environment like? What are the available learning supports within a particular campus? What are the disability supports available in this campus? And what are the IT infrastructure that we can draw on in this campus? So thinking about the interactions between those three sets of factors can enable us to identify three ways or three strategies, if you like, for enhancing inclusive learning support. One is how we can think about strengthening the inclusiveness of our curriculum design and our curriculum practice. Another is to think about how we recognise and respect difference. When we focus very much on individual reasonable adjustments, that's helpful for that particular student, but it doesn't necessarily encourage the recognition and for the range of difference we might have within a cohort of students. And then the third piece of this is thinking more broadly about how we make campuses and online spaces welcoming, safe and accommodating of difference as well. Okay, so if you are interested in it, there's some more information about the strategies that sit around this picture in the report that Annie, myself and others wrote for NCVR, and the reference to that is actually on the next slide, so my apologies, next slide. So the reference I'm referring to is Fossey, Chaffee, Benville, Ennals, Douglas, Bigby, 2015. And that document is available to download from the NCVR or National Council for Vocational and Educational Research website, if you wish to look at that. There is also a brief good practice summary guide from our study on that same website. So and there's a range of other resources I've listed on this particular slide that may be useful to you. So I hope that's been useful, and I will just hand over to Darlene for some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ali. That was actually very informative. We've had some quite good questions emailed and into our question pod. I'm just a bit concerned that they may run over time because we're kind of only really got 4 minutes to go. Yep. So if we can answer very quickly. But just to remind people who weren't there at the beginning, we will be putting the questions to Annie and Ali after this presentation, and we will post the answers on the ADSET website with the video of this session as well. One of the questions that was asked, which is easy to answer, are we able to share your PowerPoint on the website for people to be able to access after the presentation?
I'd be happy with that if Annie is also.
It's certainly.
Yep, that's great. And I might just end with a nice note here is somebody's just written to say thank you for such a comprehensive and informative webinar, and they've learned a lot, which is absolutely fantastic, which I think I can say as well. So thank you to you both for your time and also for the support from NCVR for putting this webinar on. It's fantastic, I think, for all of us to be able to sit down for an hour, even if we're eating our lunch, and listening to such wonderful research. Also, for a lot of us in the disability space and the further education space, there isn't a lot of research, so it's fantastic to have research in this space to be able to share with the sector. Just a reminder that the next presentation, next webinar is the 7th of April, and the topic for that will be supporting students with autism disorder in higher education. And that will be a focus on the design of the built environments and how it affects people on the spectrum. So that'll be another interesting topic, and hopefully we'll get as many people registered. Okay, and if people would like to ask any more questions, you can keep putting the questions up in the room, or you can email Jane Hawkswood or myself, Darlene McLennan, and we will get the questions to Annie and Ali. So thank you once again both. It's absolutely fantastic. I really appreciate your time, and it's wonderful to have been able to share your wisdom and learning with the sector.
Thank you, Darlene, and just an additional thanks to your colleagues who've done the captioning and assisted us with making the PowerPoint more accessible for people. I really appreciate that technological assistance as well.
Not a problem. Well, thank you, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.